On the cold, rainy night of her 40th birthday, Laura Mitchell was told there were no tables at La Maison. The hostess smiled but didn't budge. No exceptions. Laura stood frozen, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Invisible. She turned toward the door, carrying a rejection that all her success couldn't soften. Then a man at a corner table stood up and pulled out the empty chair across from him. "There's a seat here, if you don't mind a stranger," he said. Why would a single father reach out to someone he'd never met? Laura Mitchell had spent 20 years building a life that required no one else. At 40, she was the CFO of Harrison Capital, one of the most respected investment firms on the East Coast. She managed over 300 employees, oversaw portfolios worth billions, and answered only to the board. Her penthouse overlooked the city skyline, all glass and silence and perfect temperature control. Everything in her life ran exactly as she designed it, and yet, on the night of her 40th birthday, she found herself walking alone through the rain toward La Maison, the only person who had remembered to celebrate her. The restaurant had become her ritual over the years. She came here on promotions, on holidays, on nights when the quiet of her apartment felt too heavy. La Maison offered anonymity wrapped in elegance, white tablecloths, soft candlelight, the low hum of strangers' conversations. No one asked why she came alone. No one looked at her with pity or curiosity. She was simply another guest, well-dressed and self-contained, enjoying a meal in peace. Tonight was supposed to be no different. A glass of wine, a perfectly seared steak, and the private acknowledgement that she had made it to 40 with everything she had ever wanted. Or at least, everything she had allowed herself to want. The rain had started around 7, a cold November drizzle that turned the streets slick and reflective. Laura stepped out of her car, umbrella in hand, and walked the short distance to the entrance. The golden light spilling from the windows looked warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the gray chill outside. She pushed through the door and felt the familiar rush of heated air, the subtle scent of rosemary and butter, the quiet clink of silverware on porcelain. The hostess stand was occupied by a young woman in her mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, smile professionally bright. Laura approached with the easy confidence of someone who had walked into rooms far more intimidating than this. The hostess glanced at her tablet, then looked up with an apologetic tilt of her head. She explained that all tables were fully booked for the evening. Laura felt her smile falter, just slightly. She suggested waiting at the bar until something opened up. The hostess shook her head gently. The bar was reserved for guests with confirmed reservations only. Laura tried once more, keeping her voice pleasant, asking if perhaps there had been any cancellations. The answer was the same: polite, firm, final. There was nothing available. Perhaps another evening would work better. Laura stood there for a moment, her mind blank in a way it rarely was. She was not used to being told no. In boardrooms, she commanded attention. In negotiations, she controlled outcomes. She had built her entire career on the ability to find solutions, to navigate obstacles, to make things happen through sheer will and preparation. But here, in this small vestibule, with its tasteful floral arrangement and soft background music, she had no leverage. She was just a woman without a reservation, asking for something she couldn't have. The hostess had already turned her attention to the next guests, a couple in their 30s, laughing about something on the man's phone, clearly expected. Laura stepped aside to let them pass. They didn't notice her at all. For the first time in years, she felt invisible, not overlooked by accident, but genuinely unseen, as if she had become transparent the moment her name wasn't on a list. It was a strange sensation, almost physical, like the air around her had shifted. She had spent so long being someone who mattered in every room she entered, someone whose presence was acknowledged, whose opinions were sought, whose approval carried weight. And now she stood in the corner of a restaurant lobby, clutching her umbrella, watching strangers walk past her to their tables. The hostess didn't look at her again. There was no cruelty in it, just efficiency. Laura simply wasn't relevant to the evening's operations. She turned toward the door, already thinking about where else she might go. There were other restaurants, other options. She could order takeout and eat at home, as she had done countless times before. It wasn't a tragedy. It was just a minor inconvenience, a small disruption to her plans. And yet, as she took that first step toward the exit, something tightened in her chest. She realized that she didn't want to leave, not because she cared about the food or the ambiance, but because leaving felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to face, that she was alone on her birthday, that no one was waiting for her anywhere, that the life she had so carefully constructed had somehow left her standing in the rain, with nowhere to be and no one to call. That was when she heard the voice. It came from her left, calm and unhurried, with a slight roughness that suggested it wasn't used for public speaking. A man had risen from a corner table near the window, where a single place setting sat across from an empty chair. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with hair that had started to gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it smiled easily, though it wasn't smiling now. He wore a navy blue button-down shirt. No jacket, no tie. Simple and clean, but clearly not designer. In front of him sat a glass of red wine, half empty, and a basket of bread that hadn't been touched. He looked at Laura with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not interest, not calculation. Just a kind of quiet recognition, as if he understood exactly what had just happened and wanted to offer a way out. He explained that he hadn't meant to overhear, but his table had an extra seat. If she didn't mind sharing with a stranger, she was welcome to join him. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost casual, like he was offering directions to someone who looked lost. There was no undertone of flirtation, no hint that he expected anything in return. He simply stood there with his hand resting on the back of the empty chair, waiting for her answer. Laura hesitated. Every instinct she had developed over 20 years in business told her to decline politely and walk away. She didn't know this man. She didn't owe him anything. Sitting down would mean surrendering control of her evening to a complete stranger, accepting help she hadn't asked for, and admitting that she needed something she couldn't provide for herself. It went against everything she had learned about self-reliance, about maintaining boundaries, about never appearing vulnerable in front of people who might use it against her. She had built her entire identity around being the person who didn't need anyone else. And yet, the rain was still falling outside. She could hear it against the windows. Her apartment was waiting for her, silent and perfectly arranged, with no one to greet her when she walked in. The hostess had moved on to other tasks, and the lobby was emptying as the last of the expected guests were seated. In a few minutes, Laura would be the only person still standing here, and then she would have to make a choice that felt far larger than it should: stay and accept help from a stranger, or leave and spend her 40th birthday exactly as she had spent so many nights before, alone, accomplished, and wondering if this was really all there was. She looked at the man by the corner table. He hadn't moved, hadn't pressed, hadn't tried to convince her. He just waited, giving her the space to decide. And in that small act of patience, Laura found something she hadn't expected: permission. Permission to step outside her usual patterns, to accept an offer without calculating its cost, to be someone other than the woman who always had everything under control. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he was eating alone on a weeknight, or why he had noticed her at all. But she knew that if she walked out that door, she would spend the rest of the night thinking about what might have happened if she had stayed. Laura lowered her umbrella. She crossed the short distance to his table and pulled out the empty chair. As she sat down, the man settled back into his own seat and lifted his wine glass in a small, informal toast. He introduced himself as Ethan. Just Ethan. No last name offered, no explanation of who he was or what he did. Laura gave him her first name in return, and for a moment, that was enough. Two strangers at a corner table, the rain streaking the windows beside them, the soft glow of candlelight between them. The evening had just begun. The waiter appeared almost immediately, a middle-aged man with a practiced smile and a leather-bound menu tucked under his arm. He placed a second menu in front of Laura and asked if she would like something to drink while she decided. She ordered a glass of the same red wine Ethan had been drinking, pointing to his glass rather than asking for the name. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, amused, but not commenting. When the waiter left, they sat in a silence that felt strange, but not entirely uncomfortable. Two people who had just met, sharing a table by accident, with nothing obvious to say to each other. Laura opened her menu and studied it with more attention than necessary. The dishes were familiar. She had ordered from this menu dozens of times over the years. But reading the descriptions gave her something to focus on, a way to avoid the awkwardness of making conversation with a stranger. Ethan seemed to understand. He picked up his own menu and looked through it quietly, not rushing to fill the silence with small talk. When the waiter returned with Laura's wine, they both ordered the pan-seared scallops with lemon butter as their appetizer. Laura noticed the coincidence and glanced at Ethan, who noticed it too. They shared a small smile, the kind that acknowledged the oddness of the situation without needing to explain it. The conversation began slowly, in fragments. Ethan mentioned that the rain had been going on and off all day, and Laura agreed that November weather was unpredictable. He asked if she came to La Maison often, and she said yes, occasionally, when she wanted somewhere quiet. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. There were no follow-up questions, no attempts to dig deeper. He didn't ask what she did for a living or why she was dining alone on a weeknight. Laura found this unsettling in a way she hadn't expected. She was used to people wanting something from her: information, access, approval. Ethan's lack of curiosity felt like a closed door, polite but firm. She didn't know whether to be relieved or offended. She kept her answers vague and surface level, revealing only the most basic details. She lived in the city, had lived there for most of her adult life. She liked this restaurant because it was never too loud, and the staff didn't bother you unless you needed them. Ethan listened and offered similar fragments in return. He had grown up outside Boston, moved to the city about 10 years ago. He didn't come to places like this very often. Tonight was something of a special occasion, though he didn't explain what kind. The scallops arrived, golden and fragrant, and they ate in a companionable quiet that felt less awkward than before. Laura realized she couldn't remember the last time she had shared a meal with someone without discussing work, without calculating what the other person wanted, without performing some version of herself that wasn't quite real. The restaurant's background music had been a soft mix of jazz standards, barely noticeable beneath the murmur of other conversations. But somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, the playlist shifted. The opening notes of a familiar song drifted through the room. A piano, then strings, then the unmistakable voice of Frank Sinatra singing the first lines of "The Way You Look Tonight." Laura recognized it immediately. It was one of those songs that seemed to exist in every romantic movie and wedding reception, so familiar it had almost lost its meaning. But when she looked across the table, Ethan had stopped eating. His fork rested against the edge of his plate, and his eyes had drifted toward the window, focused on something she couldn't see. Laura waited, not wanting to interrupt whatever had taken hold of him. After a moment, Ethan turned back to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He apologized and explained that the song brought back memories. His wife had loved it. They used to dance to it in their kitchen, back when their daughter was just learning to walk. She would hold onto their legs and try to follow along, and they would laugh and spin her around until she got dizzy. It was one of those small, perfect moments that you don't realize you're living until it's already gone. Laura watched his face as he spoke, and she understood that this was not casual nostalgia. This was grief, worn smooth by time but still present. She asked about his wife, gently, giving him the choice to continue or change the subject. Ethan took a slow breath and told her. His wife's name was Emily. They had been married for 8 years when she was diagnosed with cancer, ovarian, stage 3, discovered too late. She fought for 14 months before her body gave out. Their daughter, Lily, had just turned 4. That was 4 years ago now. Ethan had spent the time since then learning how to be a father and a mother at the same time, figuring out how to braid hair and pack lunches and answer questions about why Mommy wasn't coming back. He didn't say any of this with self-pity or drama. He stated the facts the way someone might describe a car accident they had witnessed. Terrible, but already in the past, already something that had to be lived with. Laura didn't know what to say. She had never been good at comfort, at finding the right words for other people's pain. In her professional life, she dealt with problems by solving them, analyzing data, making decisions, moving forward. But there was no solution for what Ethan had been through. There was only the reality of it, sitting across the table from her, eating scallops and drinking wine on a rainy Tuesday night. She told him she was sorry, and she meant it, though the words felt inadequate. Ethan nodded and said he appreciated that. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling for a moment before turning the screen toward her. The photo showed a little girl with curly brown hair and a wide, gap-toothed smile. She was sitting on a porch step, hugging an orange tabby cat that looked mildly annoyed, but tolerant. Her eyes were bright, and there was something in her expression that reminded Laura of Ethan, a kind of openness, a willingness to trust. Ethan explained that this was Lily, who was 8 now and obsessed with animals, and currently staying with her grandmother for the night. This was actually the first time in months that he had gone out to dinner by himself. He usually spent his evenings helping with homework, making dinner, reading bedtime stories. Tonight was supposed to be a small break, a chance to remember what it felt like to be an adult in the world. Laura looked at the photo and felt something tighten in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a recognition of distance. Ethan had lost his wife, but he had Lily. He had someone to come home to, someone who needed him, someone who made the days mean something. She handed the phone back and asked what he did for work. Ethan explained that he was a carpenter. He ran a small custom furniture workshop out of a converted garage. It wasn't glamorous, but it let him set his own hours, which was essential when you were raising a kid alone. He could drop Lily off at school, pick her up in the afternoon, be there for dinner every night. The trade-off was that he would never be wealthy, never be able to give her the vacations and private schools and opportunities that other kids had. But he tried to make up for it in presence, in attention, in showing up every single day. Laura listened and found herself envying him in a way that surprised her. She had money, success, freedom, but she had built her life around the assumption that those things were enough. The main course arrived, and they ate while the conversation continued to unfold. Laura found herself sharing more than she had intended, though she still held back the most important details. She mentioned that she worked in finance, that her job was demanding, that she had made certain sacrifices to get where she was. Ethan nodded without pressing for specifics, but as the meal went on, Laura felt the weight of her own vagueness becoming uncomfortable. Here was a man who had just told her about losing his wife, about raising his daughter alone, about the fears and compromises that shaped his daily life, and she was still hiding behind generalities, still protecting herself from being truly seen. She set down her fork and looked at Ethan directly. There was something she should probably tell him, she said. She worked in finance, yes, but that was an understatement. She was the chief financial officer of Harrison Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the region. She managed over 300 employees and oversaw decisions that affected billions of dollars. The words came out flat and factual, almost like a confession. She watched Ethan's face as she spoke, waiting for the reaction she had seen so many times before. The flicker of calculation, the reassessment, the subtle shift in how people treated her once they understood what she represented. Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. He admitted that he hadn't expected that. Laura asked if it changed anything, and Ethan considered the question seriously before answering. He said it didn't change who she was, but he would be lying if he said it didn't surprise him. He made a small joke about not knowing the proper way to address a CFO, and Laura felt some of the tension release. But she also noticed something else in his expression, a hint of wariness, a slight increase in distance. She had seen it before, in dates who realized she made more money than they ever would, in colleagues who resented her authority, in friends who drifted away as her success grew. Her position was a wall, and most people either wanted to climb it or stay far away from it. She decided to tell him the rest. Today was her birthday, she said, her 40th. She had come to this restaurant because she wanted to do something nice for herself, something that felt like a celebration even if no one else was there to celebrate with her. She hadn't told anyone at work. They would have made a fuss, sent flowers, organized some awkward gathering in the conference room. She didn't want that. She just wanted a quiet evening, a good meal, a moment to acknowledge that she had made it this far. But then she had been turned away at the door, and she had realized something she had been avoiding for a long time. There was no one waiting for her, no one who would notice if she didn't come home, no one who had remembered what today was without being reminded by a calendar notification. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Laura had intended. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. Not pity, not judgment, just a kind of quiet attention. Then he told her he was sorry that her birthday had started this way. He hoped that sitting with a stranger at a borrowed table wasn't making it worse. Laura shook her head and said, honestly, that this was the most real conversation she had had in months, maybe years. She wasn't sure what that said about her life, but there it was. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke again. He told her about his own fears, the ones that kept him awake at night after Lily was asleep. He worried constantly about money, not starving, but not having enough to give her the life she deserved. Her friends went on vacations to Disney World in Europe. They had tutors and summer camps and college funds. Ethan could barely keep up with the bills some months. He worried that Lily would grow up and realize that her father wasn't enough, that she had missed out on things because he couldn't provide them. And sometimes, late at night, he thought about Emily and wondered if she would be disappointed in how he was handling everything. She had always believed in him more than he believed in himself. He wasn't sure he had lived up to that faith. Laura listened to him speak, and something shifted inside her. Here was a man who had so little compared to her. No corporate title, no investment portfolio, no penthouse with a view. And yet he had something she didn't, a reason to worry, a person who depended on him, who gave his struggles meaning, who made the hard days worth pushing through. Laura had spent 20 years building a fortress of success, and she had done it alone. She had told herself that independence was strength, that needing people was weakness, that she was better off relying only on herself. But sitting across from Ethan, hearing him talk about his daughter, with such obvious love and fear, she felt the emptiness of her own achievement. She told him the truth, more plainly than she had ever said it to anyone. He had Lily, she said. He had a reason to wake up every morning, a reason to try, a reason to be afraid. She was 40 years old. She had money and power and an apartment that could fit his entire workshop inside it. But tonight, on her birthday, there was no one to light a candle for her, no one to sing, no one to care whether she celebrated or not. He was afraid of not having enough. She had more than enough, and no one to share it with. They were both lonely, she realized, just in opposite directions. The silence that followed was different from the awkward pauses earlier in the evening. This was the silence of two people who had stopped performing for each other, who had said things that couldn't be unsaid. Ethan looked at Laura, and she looked back at him, and for a moment, there was nothing between them but honesty. He didn't try to fix what she had said or offer empty reassurances. He just sat with it, the way you sit with someone who is grieving, not because you can help, but because being present is the only thing that matters. The waiter came to clear their plates and ask about dessert. They both declined. Ethan asked for the check before Laura could reach for her purse, and when she protested, he held up a hand gently. He told her to let him do this. It wasn't much, but it was a birthday gift from a stranger who was glad he had met her tonight. Laura wanted to argue. She could have paid for the meal 100 times over without noticing. But she understood that this wasn't about money. It was about dignity, about allowing someone to give something without calculating its worth. She nodded and said thank you, and Ethan smiled in a way that finally reached his eyes. They walked out of the restaurant together into a night that had changed while they were inside. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and reflective, the air cold and clean. Street lights cast long yellow streaks across the pavement, and somewhere in the distance a car horn echoed. Laura and Ethan stood on the sidewalk outside La Maison, neither of them moving toward their separate destinations. There was a feeling of something unfinished, a door that had been opened, but not walked through. Laura thought about asking for his phone number, about suggesting they meet again sometime, but the words didn't come. She wasn't sure why. Maybe fear, maybe pride, maybe just the sense that whatever had happened tonight was too fragile to plan around. Ethan turned to face her, his hands in his pockets against the cold. He thanked her for sitting with him, for listening, for sharing things she probably didn't share with many people. He said it had been a long time since he had talked to someone like this. Really talked, not just exchanged pleasantries. Laura told him she felt the same way. And then they stood there, two people who had become briefly real to each other, unsure how to say goodbye. Ethan extended his hand, and Laura took it. His palm was warm and rough, the skin calloused from years of working with wood and tools. She felt the texture of his life in that handshake, the physical labor, the careful craftsmanship, the hands that had built furniture and braided his daughter's hair and held his wife as she died. They held on for a moment longer than necessary, neither of them willing to be the first to let go. Then Ethan released her hand and stepped back. He wished her a happy birthday, his voice soft but sincere. He told her he hoped that 40 would be different, better, fuller, less alone. Then he smiled one more time, turned, and walked away toward the bus stop at the end of the block. Laura stood and watched him go, his figure growing smaller against the wet pavement and the distant lights. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know where he lived or how to find him again. She only knew that he was Ethan, a carpenter, a father, a widower, a man who had offered her a chair when she had nowhere else to sit. And as his silhouette disappeared around the corner, she realized that this stranger had given her something she hadn't received from anyone in years, the feeling of being seen. The cab dropped Laura off in front of her building just before 11. The doorman greeted her by name and held the door open, and she nodded without really seeing him. The elevator carried her up 32 floors in silence, and when she stepped into her penthouse, everything was exactly as she had left it. The lights came on automatically, sensing her presence. The climate control had already adjusted to her preferred temperature. Soft piano music drifted from the speakers embedded in the ceiling, a playlist she had programmed months ago and never thought about since. Everything was perfect. Everything was empty. Laura set her purse on the console table by the door and walked slowly into the living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city at night. Towers of glass and steel, thousands of lit windows, the distant red taillights of cars moving through streets far below. She had paid a small fortune for this view. She had stood in front of these windows countless times, drink in hand, feeling powerful and accomplished and utterly alone. Tonight, the view looked the same as always, but something inside her had shifted. She sank onto the sofa and stared out at the lights, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry. The tears came quietly at first, then harder, until her shoulders shook and her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know exactly what she was crying for, The birthday that no one had remembered. The dinner with a stranger who had seen her more clearly than anyone in years. The 20 years of choices that had brought her to this beautiful, silent apartment with no one to share it. She cried for the life she had built and the life she had missed. She cried for the woman she had become and the woman she might have been. And when the tears finally stopped, she sat in the darkness for a long time, watching the city lights blur and sharpen through the residue on her lashes. The next morning, Laura arrived at Harrison Capital at exactly 8:15, the same time she arrived every day. Her assistant had already placed a coffee on her desk, along with a folder containing the briefing materials for the 9 o'clock meeting. Laura reviewed the documents with her usual precision, making notes in the margins, flagging questions to raise with the team. The M&A deal they were discussing was significant, an acquisition that would reshape the company's portfolio and require months of careful integration. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes decision that had defined her career, the kind of challenge she had always thrived on. The meeting took place in the main conference room on the executive floor. 12 people sat around the polished table. Vice presidents, directors, legal counsel, the CEO himself. Laura took her seat at the head, as she always did for financial matters, and led the discussion with her characteristic clarity. She walked them through the numbers, the risks, the projected returns. She answered questions without hesitation and addressed concerns with data and logic. By 10:30, the decision was made. They would proceed with the acquisition. Everyone agreed it was the right move. Everyone thanked Laura for her thorough analysis. And then, one by one, they gathered their papers and filed out of the room. Laura stayed behind after the others had gone. She sat alone at the long table, her hands folded in front of her, staring at the empty chairs where her colleagues had been. 12 people had sat in this room with her for 90 minutes. Not one of them knew that yesterday had been her birthday. Not one of them had asked how she was doing, whether she had plans for the evening, whether there was anything in her life besides spreadsheets and strategy. They looked at her and saw a title, a function, a resource. They respected her expertise and relied on her judgment. But they didn't see her. They never had. She thought about Ethan, standing outside the restaurant in the cold night air. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he wished her happy birthday, not as a CFO or a colleague or a networking opportunity, but as a person. A woman turning 40 with no one to celebrate with. He had seen that, and he had stayed anyway. He had listened and shared and offered something real in a world where everything Laura encountered was calculated and transactional. And now, he was gone, back to his workshop, and his daughter, and his small, meaningful life. She didn't even know his last name. The days that followed felt different, though nothing on the surface had changed. Laura went to work, attended meetings, made decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. She came home to her penthouse, ate dinner alone, went to bed at a reasonable hour. The routines of her life continued exactly as they always had. But underneath the familiar patterns, something was stirring. A restlessness she couldn't name, a question she couldn't stop asking herself. Is this enough? She kept thinking about what Ethan had said, about his fears of not being enough for Lily. He worked with his hands, lived paycheck to paycheck, couldn't afford the luxuries that other families took for granted. And yet he had something Laura didn't. A reason. A person who needed him, who loved him, who made his struggles meaningful. He woke up every morning knowing that his daughter was counting on him. Laura woke up every morning knowing that her company was counting on her. But that wasn't the same thing. The company would survive without her. They would hire someone else, promote from within, adjust, and move on. She was valuable, but she was replaceable. No one was counting on her in the way that mattered. She had spent 20 years telling herself that independence was strength, that needing people was a liability, a vulnerability that could be exploited. She had watched colleagues get derailed by messy divorces, family emergencies, the unpredictable demands of relationships. She had chosen to avoid all of that, to keep her life clean and controlled and entirely her own. And she had succeeded beyond her own expectations. But sitting alone in her office, looking out at the city she had conquered, Laura finally allowed herself to admit what that success had cost her. She had built an empire of one, a fortress with no one inside but herself. Late that night, Laura stood at the window of her penthouse with a glass of red wine in her hand. It was the same varietal Ethan had been drinking at La Maison. She had noticed the label when he ordered, and she had bought a bottle on her way home. She didn't know why. Maybe she wanted to remember. Maybe she wanted to hold on to something from that strange, unexpected evening before it faded completely. Outside, the city glittered in the darkness, indifferent and beautiful. Her phone sat on the table behind her, silent as always. No missed calls, no new messages, no one wondering where she was or whether she was okay. She thought about Ethan walking away toward the bus stop, his figure disappearing around the corner. She didn't have his number. She didn't know where he lived or where his workshop was. If she wanted to find him, she would have to search through every carpenter in the city, hoping to stumble across a man named Ethan with a daughter named Lily and a wife who had died 4 years ago. It was possible, but it felt wrong somehow. What had happened between them wasn't meant to be continued. It was a single evening, a crack in the walls they had both built, a glimpse of what connection could feel like. Trying to force it into something more would only diminish what it had been. But that didn't mean she had to go back to the way things were. Ethan had shown her something important, even if he didn't know it. He had shown her that it was possible to be vulnerable, to share your fears with a stranger, to ask for help and accept it without shame. He had lost everything and rebuilt his life around the one person who mattered most to him. Laura hadn't lost anything, but she hadn't built anything either. Not anything that would last beyond her career, beyond her bank account, beyond the glass walls of this penthouse. She turned away from the window and picked up her phone. Her thumb scrolled through the contacts, names she hadn't called in months or years, former colleagues, distant relatives, people she had let drift away because maintaining relationships took time she didn't want to spend. She stopped at a name near the bottom of the list. Mom. Her mother lived 3 hours away, in the same small town where Laura had grown up. They talked on holidays, exchanged birthday cards, kept up the minimum required to call themselves family. Laura couldn't remember the last time she had called just to talk. She stared at the name for a long moment. Then she pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, surprised and slightly worried. Her mother asked if everything was all right, if something had happened. Laura felt her throat tighten, but she kept her voice steady. She told her mother that nothing was wrong. She just wanted to talk. That was all. Just to hear her voice, just to say hello, just to remember that there was someone in the world who had known her before she became this. Outside the window, the city lights continued to glow, unchanged and unchanging. But Laura felt something different in the silence of her apartment. Something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't happiness exactly, or hope, or even certainty. It was smaller than that and more fragile. It was the beginning of a question. What if things could be different? What if she let them be? She didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time in 20 years, she wanted to find out. And that, she realized, was the most honest gift her 40th birthday had given her. Not a table at a restaurant, not a stranger's kindness, but the courage to finally look at her life and admit that something needed to change.